casts many aspersions on the idea of democracy. His objection to democracy was, you remember, that it results very rapidly in anarchy because of the conflicts of opinion among people, the fact that they're insufficiently well informed, too self-interested, too short-termist. And as a result, the anarchy that ensues so rapidly on democracy would simply invite a strongman in, a tyrant who would come in to restore order, given that anarchy is exhausting and that nothing can be done, that people very, very quickly weary of it, and they welcome with open arms the return of order of the kind imposed by a tyrant. And so for Plato, democracy is merely the exordium, the vestibule to tyranny. And this view, the view that democracy is an unstable and unfeasible form of government for the reasons that he specifies, namely the lack of information, the short-termism, the self-interest, the conflicts that arise, was a view that persisted all the way through history until really rather recently, until the beginning of modern times, actually in the 17th century. And it meant that people never talked about democracy in positive terms, at any rate, even if they wanted to try to return some degree of consent or authority to the hands of a wider group of people, just than a ruling class. And it wasn't until 101 years ago, 1917 in fact, that a leader of a great state talked in positive terms about democracy. And that was Woodrow Wilson, who said in 1917 that he was going to take the United States of America into the First World War to defend democracy. But prior to that time, I mean, even back among the founding fathers of the United States of America, who set up institutions that would make democracy possible, at any rate, that was the aim of it, even they were allergic to the use of the term itself, because of the negative connotations that it had. And the reasons that Plato gave are reasons that people have always recognized as being something that you might invoke in opposition to the idea that the demos, the people, should have final authority, political authority in a state. Winston Churchill himself more famously said democracy is the least bad of a lot of bad systems. But he also said the strongest argument against it is 2 minutes or 3 minutes conversation with any voter, meaning that that would immediately expose this problem about lack of information and short-termism and so on. H.L. Mencken, the satirist, said, "A belief in democracy is a belief that collective wisdom will issue from individual ignorance." And that's quite a devastating sort of remark about the possibilities. But what is so interesting about those negative views, about giving to the people, giving to ordinary citizens of a state, a say in choosing the government under which they'll live, and therefore the laws by which they will live, is that it completely misses the point to talk about their lack of information or their self-interest and so on. It completely misses the point. Because the real point is that if you're a citizen of a state, you, just in virtue of that fact, and unless you have done something that legitimizes dispossessing you of a voice, just in virtue of being a citizen, you have a right to a voice. You have a right to a say in choosing how things will be organized, given that you're going to live in that organization. This is beautifully put by a remark by Colonel Rainborough in the Putney debates in 1647. You may remember that in an intermission in the Civil War, it was at a period just after Charles I had been defeated, and he was put under house arrest in Hampton Court Palace. Not a bad place to be under house arrest in, I don't suppose. And the new model army, commanded by Fairfax and Cromwell, had met just outside London, as it then was, at the village of Putney. And the soldiers of the new model army, or at any rate some of them, under partly the influence of the levellers, the people who were very keen to use the opportunity of the Civil War to reorder the constitution of this country, put forward what they called an agreement of the people. It was a document that was drawn up in Putney on the evening before a meeting between the so-called agitators of the New Model Army. That was a word of benign and neutral meaning. It was an alternative to agent. So agents of the New Model Army were going to meet the grandees of the army, as they were called, Cromwell and Art and others, to talk to them about what the soldiers wanted to see come out of a peace agreement, given that they, the soldiers, had risked their lives in support of Parliament against the king. And they set out what we would now regard as a set of very modest demands. So for biennial parliaments and universal adult male suffrage, of course male suffrage, and due process of law, reform of the House of Lords, things that we would now regard as being, pretty mild fare. But the demands were regarded with horror by the grandees of the New Model Army, and you can read, because a transcript was made of the debates in Putney, you can actually read the exchanges. Ireton, for example, Cromwell's son-in-law, said, there is no way that we could have universal male suffrage, because that would mean that we would be giving votes or a voice to people who have no property, people who have no money. And only people who have property and money have a real interest in the state and in making sure that the state works properly, because they've got a real claim. And if you give the vote to people who don't have any property, what are they going to do with it? They're going to use it to take away the property of the people who have property. And we're not going to have any of that. So that kind of idea was batted back. And as you know, when you recall the memory of what happened in the years immediately after 1647, the Levellers eventually came to be cracked down on. They were imprisoned, some of them executed indeed. And this moment of demand, this opportunity, as it might have been indeed, for a more democratic order, was lost. But during the discussions, Colonel Rainborough famously said, in response to Ireton's point about only property people should have a voice, he said, surely the poorest he in England, the poorest he, has as much right as the richest he to a voice in choosing how and by what arrangements he will live. And that is the key idea in democracy. It has nothing to do with how educated or informed or propertied you are. It's just a right of citizenship. Now, the realization that there is something in that dawned over the Enlightenment period and the 19th century. You see it in the thinking of people who decided to try to create a way of making it possible for that right, the right to have a voice, the right to a say, into the second right that people have. And that second right is a really important one, and unfortunately it is too little attended to. That second right is a right to good enough government. Now, I use that phrase, good enough, rather than just a right to good government, because as you know, outside this room, nothing in our world is perfect. So it's extremely unlikely that we're going to get good government, which is always and invariably good. But what we want is good enough government. That is, government which is such that all the other rights, liberties, opportunities that we wish to have in a mature, advanced, reflective society like ours, our civil liberties, for example, they would only be protected, they would only be accessible to us if the order in our society is a relatively stable and open one. And that requires that government be reasonably effective, reasonably efficient, and such that we know what's going on in that government. It has sufficient degree of transparency, and also that we can recall it if it's not functioning properly, and we can see if other people can do better. And so the idea that the right to a voice must be able to be parlayed into or translated into good enough government is a very, very important one, which from the late 17th century through the Enlightenment period began to be worked out by people who took that point. If you remember Locke's second treatise on government, where he talks about the rights and duties of Parliament vis-a-vis the Crown. And you remember, of course, the really important point about the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 was that a doctrine that had been very influential for some time beforehand, the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which underlay the idea of the absolutism or near-absolutism of monarchy, and the king being above the law or being the embodiment of the law and so on, that idea was overturned in the revolution of the 1680s in this country, where Parliament substituted itself for the deity because it chose the next king after James II had in effect abdicated by running away. So Parliament chose William of Orange to come and be the king, along with Mary, the sort of fig leaf of dynastic continuity. And Parliament, of course, has thought itself in the place of the deity ever since, you may imagine. But this was a very important constitutional development. And you will remember that the first treatise on government by Locke was a very long refutation of Filmer's account of the doctrine of divine right. So it marked a moment of transition and thinking about where authority lay. For Locke, it lay in the hands, effectively, of the bourgeoisie. So it lay in the hands of Parliament and those who, the very limited franchise who elected Parliament. But the door had been opened to thinking about extending that franchise and making Parliament more representative. And that introduced, therefore, the idea in that word, representative, which came to be a very fundamental part of thinking about how you could get the right of citizens to have a voice into their right to have good enough government. Locke himself actually had used the word representative when he talked about Parliament, meaning crowned lords and commons assembled together, representing the people, not in the sense that the people, or very many of them, had elected them, but in the sense that they stood for their interests, they acted on their behalf, they were representing them in that sense. But during the 18th and 19th centuries, people began to see that if the organs of government, organs of the state, were to have a real substance, they needed the consent of the people in a more genuinely representative sense. That is, that there had to be a way of capturing the consent of the people, capturing their voices as a way of underwriting the authority of government. And this is what was worked out first in Montesquieu and then, of course, in the setting up of the new United States of America at the end of the 18th century. Interestingly enough, Montesquieu modeled his own views about how a state should operate on England and the English Crown and Parliament arrangement. Because he thought, what you need is you need two houses of Parliament so they can sort of check one another. You need an executive, which he thought of as the monarch. And then you need an independent judiciary with powers to monitor the exercise of the constitutional rights of the other three organs of state. This, in the case of the United States of America, resulted in setting up Congress with its House of Representatives and the Senate, the executive arm, which is the presidency, and the Supreme Court, which is the judicial arm that monitors the exercise of the Constitution by the other arms. It happens, of course, that Montesquieu's view about how things worked in England was mistaken because the executive is not the crown, and it ceased to be the crown especially after the beginning of the Hanoverian succession. This was because the first couple of Georges couldn't speak English, so they didn't take much part in cabinet government. And under Walpole, of course, the executive came to be drawn from whichever grouping in Parliament could be commanded by the executive. With the extension of the franchise in spreading of votes to more and more people during the 19th century, this developed the party machine and the whipping system so that parties, the executive could have control of their parties in the House of Commons. So instead of the executive being answerable to the legislature, as was the ideal in Montesquieu and what is meant to be the case in the United States of America, it turns out that the legislature here in the UK is the creature of the executive, is subordinate to it and can be whipped to support it. So it doesn't hold it to account very effectively, as we see, alas, in recent events. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. But the general idea is that you set up these institutions because it is in the institutions and the practices of these institutions that the voice of consent is turned into government. So you can take all the diversity of opinions and the conflict, and it doesn't matter what people think or know or anything else, they express their opinion at a moment in an election, and then out of this you get an agreement that these instruments of government will operate, that they have the authority, the overall consent of the people, and then if the institutions themselves function well, if they are not a matter of the individuals in them, the whim of powerful people, but a result of the practices laid down for the proper functioning of these institutions, then that consent will have been turned into good enough government. That is the ideal. And it turns on the idea that the people who populate and run the institutions are representatives of the people, not delegates, not messenger boys and girls, but representatives. That is, they are voted into their task of going to the center of government, getting information, listening to arguments, debating and discussing, making informed, good judgments and acting on them in the interests of the people, who've sent them there to do that job of work. That is the ideal. So when you read Mill, for example, Representative Government, it was published in the 1850s, I think, in the run-up to another extension of the franchise. Remember, after the Great Reform Bill of 1832, that time, of course, people thought that that was enough of a sop to people who wanted the vote. They extended the franchise a tiny little bit and reorganized some of the seats from rotten boroughs to the new big industrial cities. And people thought that would end the matter. But then, of course, it just fed the appetite of more and more people wanting to have a say as well. So during the course of the 19th century, the franchise was extended further and further until by the First World War, it was practically a universal adult male suffrage. In 1919, as a result of the great contribution made to the war effort by women in the munitions industries and hospitals and elsewhere, the vote was given to women aged 30 and over. The thought then was that by that age, women would have grown a brain cell or two and could read a newspaper and stuff. But then it was in 1928 that the voting age was equalized at last between men and women at 21. It's only in 1968 that the voting age was lowered to 18, the age of majority. So you can see that the process of extending the franchise, and of course it hasn't got to where it should go, because it really should be at 16, not 18. Some of you disagree with that, but I think there are very strong reasons for thinking so. So we are still in process of extending the franchise to people whose futures are implicated in the kinds of things we do, voting for governments and voting in referendums. It's been a long, slow process and a very difficult one. And at each stage of extension of the franchise, politicians and the political order has found ways of managing the extension of the franchise by getting their hands more and more on levers of control of government, principally through things like the nature of the voting system. For example, if you have a first-past-the-post voting system as we have in this country, and which should change, we really desperately need to reform that, then you can be pretty sure that you can get majorities for one rather than another political interest on minorities of the popular vote. That's pretty standard in this country. This is a very, very artificial and distorting system. More importantly still, as the franchise has extended, so the party machine has become much, much more effective in managing itself. In the United Kingdom, for example, we have the whipping system. So if you were elected as a member of parliament on a party political platform, you are under the discipline of that party, and you are expected to support its manifesto pledges in Parliament, which is reasonable enough since you were elected on the basis of them. But you are also expected to support the party of which you're a member. And if your party is in the majority and forms the government, then you are expected to support the government. If you don't, if you vote against the government, you're in danger of losing the whip. And losing the whip is a very serious matter, because it means you don't get help and support and finance and posters and speakers and campaign literature and so on at the next election. You have to stand as an independent. You don't have the party machine behind you. It also means that you might lose an opportunity of office, of becoming a minister. So your ambitions to become a cabinet minister or prime minister or something will be dished by losing the party whip. So it's a powerful instrument of control. And actually, if you talk to MPs, they will tell you that the rather standard thing that happens is when you're first elected, the whips invite you to tea, and they tell you that they're absolutely delighted that you've been voted into Parliament because you're just the person that the party needs, and we're so happy to have you here, and we want to look after you while you're here. And that means if there's anything going on with your secretary, or you've had your fingers in the till or anything like that, you better tell us, so that if anything starts coming out in the Daily Express, we'll know how to handle it, and we'll watch your back for you. A couple of weeks later, your government or your party decides to vote in a way that you think is unconscionable, and you say, I'm not going to vote for that. And then the whips will say, you jolly well better, otherwise there's going to be an extremely uncomfortable story in the Daily Express tomorrow morning, because they know all your secrets. Incidentally, they go looking for those secrets too without having to ask you. Still, the idea that the three great instruments of control exercised by the party whips, bullying, blackmail, and bribery, very, very commonplace. There's even been instances in the recent past where a member of parliament was frog-marched into the lobby his party wanted him in, with his arm up behind his back, held there rather firmly by two other members of parliament. Result? The result is that when people get into parliament as members, they are coerced by the party discipline system into representing their party line, not their constituents or the country, if the party line happens not to be in the interests of either. And that seems to me to be a great problem. You may think I'm overemphasizing it, but this is something which has happened in almost all of our parliamentary democracies around the world, including the United States of America. Party machines are now essential to the functioning of government, and they are anti-democratic in their effect, in just the way that I've described to you now. And this has been the reaction of organized politics to extension of the franchise and the attempt to democratize society. It represents an effort to manage those institutions which are meant to parlay the voice of the people into good enough government. And they therefore represent a way in which the desires of interest groups in society have come to be effective in those institutions, when originally the institutions were devised to get us away from the whim of people, of human beings, like a monarch, for example. Get away from what particular individuals want and think and how they're going to manipulate things, so that we have structures and practices that do it for us, a bit like the law. If you look at the operation of the law in most advanced societies, you will see that they rather paradigmatically if only one were able to get access to it financially, operate in just the way that we want an institution to operate. I mean, really effectively and scrupulously and independently of individual human whim, which is what we want those institutions to do. But of course, if they become captured by things like party machines or powerful individuals, then they don't work in our interests. So the idea of representative democracy, and you see it, for example, in Mill's book, Representative Government, because he is writing at the end of a process in which, if you go back to the documents, the debates, the letters, the Federalist Papers in the United States, as they were trying to set up a totally new political and governmental order there, constructing these institutions, those endeavors embodied the idea of how you could make a representative democracy work. As I say, they didn't use the word democracy. They regarded democracy in exactly the same light that Plato did, which is one reason why the institutions that they constructed acted and were designed to act as a kind of filter for the ochlocratic tendencies of democracy. There's a great word, ochlocracy, O-C-H, ochlocracy. It means rule by the mob rule. Plato's point was that democracy was just a disguised form of ochlocracy and would very soon collapse into it. And the ochlocratic tendencies of having a lot of short-termists and uninformed people running the government, as Plato saw it, a very condescending and lofty sort of way, were the danger identified by him, and which these institutions were meant to filter out. So you could get the consent of the people, and this phrase, the consent of the people, was Jefferson's phrase. And if you meditate on that phrase, you will see it doesn't say the authority of the people or the will of the people. It says the consent of the people. That the people will consent to these institutions working on their behalf. And since they are institutions and not monarchs or individuals to whom we have devolved power, not absolute sovereigns in the Hobbesian sense of somebody who, having been given power by the people, now exercises it without any further reference to them. No, but institutions which are ultimately consented to and which can be recalled and repopulated. What's gone wrong with our democracies is the fact that those institutions have been taken over by people who know how to work them to their own ends. They've done it by means of the voting system, which really distorts that consent. They've done it by means of techniques of operation, as with the party machine system. But they have also done it because by making sure that the kinds of information that they give, that political parties give to people at election time, the organization of party political platforms will itself be such that it can try to capture as much of the support or consent of the people as it's possible to capture without expecting the people to have the kind of fine-grained, highly detailed appreciation of the actual public policy implications of what it is they're voting for. So the use of campaigning techniques. And this is a respect in which I think the problem with our democracies has now come to be very badly exposed. We've all, I think, been dissatisfied with politics and with politicians for a long time. We all think, well, they're a bit dodgy and things don't ever really work out all that well. But we kind of go along. We give a sort of tacit semi-consent to the way things work, mainly because most of us have got other and better things to do. We've got our jobs and families and careers and things that we're interested in. Attending union debates and so on. So we don't really want to spend all our time poring over the fine details of acts of parliament or looking over the shoulders of our politicians. We hope that they're going to behave in reasonably responsible ways, and we hope that our institutions will constrain what it is they can do. But in very recent years, the ways in which politics and the institutions of politics have let us down have been sort of weaponized by the uses now made of the kind of information and the kind of opportunities offered by social media. And this sounds like a bit of a scare story, but everything I'm just about to tell you is out in the public domain, as you know. If you're assiduous readers of the Observer newspaper, for example, some of what I'm about to say will be very familiar to you. As follows. Take a couple of steps back. You know that if you use Google or WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter or anything else, that the providers of these services monitor your activity out there in cyberspace, mainly so that they can target advertising at you and that they can use the information that they harvest from your activity to sell on to other providers of services or of advertising. I was told by a friend who came over from New York a couple of weeks ago that he had put up on his Google Calendar that he had an outpatient's appointment at a hospital in Manhattan that week, and he was instantly bombarded for the next 3 days by advertisements for his local crematorium, which just shows you how very closely you're tracked by these algorithms that are watching what your activity is. So the main reason is that it's for advertising. But there is a secondary reason, which is that when you go, for example, onto Google to get some information, supposing you want to know who the fourth wife of Henry VIII was, well, Google will give you that information, but it will give you the information and in the form that it thinks on the basis of your profile that you would like to have. I should like you to reflect on that for a moment. You go on the internet to get some information, and you were given information that some algorithm thinks that, given your profile, you would like to have. And it's rather interesting and potentially rather subversive. But the real point here is that these targetings of advertising and these sculptings of the way information is given to you on the basis of what these services know about you depends very much on the profiling that these services do of you. In fact, the profiles that they come up with of you on the basis of your use of social media are so accurate and so precise that they very probably know more about you than you know about yourself. And not only about individuals, but also, therefore, about groups of individuals who share certain concerns and interests together. And this is where elections and referendums come into focus, particularly in the case of any election which is between one person and another, like a presidential election, Clinton, Trump, or a referendum, in, out, yes, no, when any kind of binary voting situation. Because in such a situation, you will have two blocks of voters, the Trump voters and the Clinton voters, or the ins or the outs. And in between those two blocks, there will be a group of people who are undecided or who are don't knows or who are manipulable or who could be persuaded to change their view, who may not have one and who could therefore be given a view. So it is that group in between the two voting blocks who provide a target for this activity, because if they can be moved in one direction rather than the other, they will tip the balance for the one side rather than the other. This happened in the case of the Trump election. He received over 3 million votes fewer than Hillary Clinton did, but he got the right votes in the right place to capture the Electoral College. Footnote, the Electoral College was set up in order to prevent completely unsuitable people ever becoming president. It only ever once actually blocked anybody. It was back in the middle of the 19th century. It blocked a vice presidential candidate. But if ever its existence would have been justified, it might have been recently. Still, the targeting of groups of people in the right places to get the right result, turned out to be extremely effective in the Trump case. Now, you may remember that during the course of the autumn before Trump was elected, he said at a rally, "I am Mr. Brexit." Do you remember that occasion? "I am Mr. Brexit," he said. Why? Well, because his campaign team had employed the same big data analytics company that had been used so successfully in the EU referendum, a company called Cambridge Analytica. I have to say, speaking as an Oxford man, I know that Cambridge Analytica has nothing to do with the university, so you can rest content. Now, Cambridge Analytica is one of these companies which does profiling and helps people to use this extraordinarily powerful technique, which is known as hyper-targeting of very, very precisely defined groups of people. You may have seen just a few months ago a program on the BBC Horizon, a program which showed how this worked in the case of the Trump election. Indeed, they showed the very office where the Trump campaign team was based, and the office next door on one side where Facebook was situated, and the office on the other side where Cambridge Analytica had their desks and computers. And what they did was they took these profiles, which reaped from social media, and they were able to identify very, very particular groups of people, and they tested messaging on those groups of people until they knew that those messages were really having an effect. And of course, there are metrics which enable you to see when you're getting real resonance from a group. So you can hyper-target, that is this tailored, very precise message suitable for that group, and you know when you've got them, you know when you've hooked them in, because they start to retweet or forward or like on Facebook or quote it or so on. And then you've got a different message for that group. Same thing happens. You hyper-target that group with a quite different message. And eventually you can aggregate a number of groups of people who may have nothing else in common with one another other than that they've responded to messages which have been tailored to them. If they do know about one another, they might have nothing, they may even be hostile to one another. It doesn't matter. You've just aggregated them for a single purpose. That happened in the case of the Trump election, and it happened in the case of the EU referendum. Their messaging went to people who were identified as having sympathies to the Leave side of the argument. Messaging also, however, went to Remainers from the people working on behalf of Leave to persuade people of the Remain persuasion that Remain was likely to win quite easily. The reason for this is, if you're a psephologist, you can predict with great accuracy the drop in the turnout in a constituency if it rains in that constituency on a voting day. As it happens, it rained in London on the 23rd of June 2016. The predictable drop in turnout happened, and the drop was greater than the margin of victory by Leave. A lot of people have been targeted with the message that because Remain was going to win easily, that meant you didn't have to go out to vote. You look out of the window, it's pouring with rain, you think to yourself, oh, well, I'm going to win anyway, I'm not going to bother, I'm going to stay in and watch telly. So it's very, very clever use of messaging, carefully targeted, and having an effect. Now, this is going to happen. It's going to happen from now on. Social media is out there. Big data techniques are already in operation in many, many fields. For example, in epidemiology or medicine in general, science, history. Big data techniques are incredibly powerful and a great epistemological tool. They're going to teach us a lot of very valuable stuff about our world and about ourselves. But when you use these techniques to influence people or persuade them, then only if the use of those techniques is transparent, only if we know that we are being hyper-targeted and we know who is sending us the messages and why and who's paying for them, only then is it acceptable. In the case both of the EU referendum and of the Trump election, this wasn't known. It was hidden persuasion, and the agenda that lay behind it was opaque to people. And that is a subversion of democracy, obviously, because democracy requires information and transparency. So, to cut a long story short about all the things that recent events have exposed in our democratic order, one needs to think a little bit about what kinds of reforms might be necessary. Just before I do, I'll mention one thing, that among all the explanations, excuses, claims that are made about the EU referendum vote here, one was that a lot of people who voted leave were not really voting about membership of the EU, but were voting in protest against the fact that they felt left behind, that the areas of their countries, of our country, were economically disadvantaged, that a kind of populist movement had arisen, as it seems to have done elsewhere in Europe and in North America, and that this was what resulted in Brexit and Trump. I just want to make one remark about that, which is this. Personally, I don't believe that there is such a thing as populism in the sense in which people normally describe it, as a kind of grassroots upswelling of rage and anger. I think that happens, but it happens only if there is demagoguery, only if there are people who will go out and make it happen, who will go to people who are feeling left behind, who are disadvantaged, who are out of work, and who say, I feel your pain, I know that you're in big trouble, and I know who to blame. And you can point a finger, as it might be at the Clintons or at the EU or whoever you want to blame. And we can solve your problem by getting rid of them or by attacking them. The reason why I think this is that every economy is always in transition. Every economy is always undergoing change. It's of the very nature of capitalism in general, but indeed any economy, if you think about it, that innovation, new technologies coming on stream, new markets being opened, old ones dying away. So economies are always in transition, which means there are always people being left behind. There are always people in industries or sectors of the economy which are declining, and it takes time. There's always a time lag for them to move into sectors of the economy which are on the up. So this is always happening. Good government would address that constantly, would be constantly alert to people who are being left behind and who are being disadvantaged by transition. Because all you have to do is to think of a single individual out of work and what it's like to be out of work. What it's like to live in a town where there's a considerable amount of unemployment and the local cafe is closed down because not enough people go and use it any longer, and so on. Think of the attrition to human lives and to the fabric of our society when economic downturns happen in an area or in an economy. So good government should be very attentive to that, but all the more so when inequality in society has increased, because it is inequality which is the most toxic and dangerous thing in a society. It's not poverty. If everybody's poor, everybody kind of puts up with it. But when you get what we've seen in the last 30 years, third of a century, that is people on middle and lower incomes stagnating and in some cases getting left behind by economic changes, by robotics and factories and so on. And at the same time, you see the top 1 or 2% benefiting from a fourfold increase in their wealth, as has happened since 2008. Then you see the gap between the rich and poor has become incredibly much larger and very noticeable, and it creates an enormous amount of frustration and resentment. And the frustration and resentment is felt by people who, because they're unemployed or poor or struggling, are not in a position to organize and to start revolutions. This is why the idea that populism is a kind of self-motivating upsurge from the grassroots is a rather implausible one. But they are ripe for demagogues. They're ripe for Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders and Nigel Farage and people like that who come. And Trump. Trump is a man of the people. From his penthouse in Trump Tower in Fifth Avenue, New York, is a man of the people. And this is so interesting, isn't it, that the people who come along as the demagogues who are going to rescue those who feel resentful and so tend not really to be of them. It's a pretty rare occasion. You can go back to things like the Peasants' Revolt or Wat Tyler, where the leaders of these movements were from the people themselves. They tend to be very localized, very limited in time, and very quickly put down. But great movements like the election of a US president or like Brexit will happen only because some sentiment has been captured by people who have the ability to make use of it in those institutions which themselves should be a protection against demagoguery. So the very, very great need for thinking about constitutional matters, and the reason why I put it like that is this. We have a constitution in the United Kingdom which, as you know, is largely unwritten, although there are, of course, various aspects of it which are embodied in statute, but there's a tremendous mishmash of those. So our constitution has been very well described as a set of understandings that nobody understands. And this, of course, is very useful to politicians and to governments. How useful, you will notice from the last 4 referendums that we've had in the United Kingdom, each one of them on a completely different basis. Each one of them a different franchise, a different group of people given the vote for them. Some of them with a threshold, some of them without. No question of supermajority, which is what you would expect for major constitutional change. And so we have the following anomaly, that the EU referendum of June 2016 was said to be advisory, consultative only. Now, this is something you can check up. It's in the public domain. You can go online. Call up House of Commons briefing paper 07212, published on the 3rd of June 2015, just before the debate in the House of Commons on the bill. And you will read in section 5 that it says, this is an advisory exercise. It is not binding on government or parliament. Section 6 reminds MPs, by the way, these briefing papers are written in short sentences and words of one syllable so that MPs can kind of understand what it is they're meant to be debating in Parliament. Section 6 suggests that if there were any thought that it was going to be binding or mandating, it should have a supermajority built into it, supermajority requirement. In the House of Commons on the 16th of June 2015, Mr. Lidington, who was then the Minister for Europe, in answer to a question said, this referendum is only advisory, only consultative. It's not going to bind the government or parliament. You know, that's why we don't have to extend the franchise as we did for the Scottish independence referendum to 16 and 17-year-olds and to EU citizens of other EU countries living, working, paying their taxes here. So we're not going to include them. We know from David Cameron's public statements after the referendum that he didn't fight to include them because he didn't want to have to argue with the right wing of his party about it. So it was a restricted franchise, it was advisory only, and yet the minute that there was an apparent majority, 51.9% of votes cast on the day, it was treated as if it was mandating. Now to do that is to play ducks and drakes with our constitution, is to make it up as you go along. Worse still, when you dig into the EU referendum, you see that restricted franchise, that is excluding 16, 17-year-olds and EU citizens of other EU countries, of that restricted franchise, only 37% of the total electorate voted leave. Only 37% of the total electorate. Now, it takes 40% of the total membership of a trades union for a strike to be legitimate. It takes 66% of all sitting members of the House of Commons for a general election to be called out of term. And yet, to take the UK out of the EU, with all the massive consequences of doing it, 37% of the total electorate is regarded not merely as enough, but as mandating. Oddly enough, Mrs. May, you may have heard of her, she called a general election last year asking for a mandate to take the UK out of the EU, an admission that the referendum, in fact, wasn't one. and she lost her majority. So you may very well ask yourself the question, how, constitutionally speaking, can this process that we appear to be going through, the Brexit process, how can that be legitimate? Well, one thing that comes out of it absolutely starkly and clearly is that we need clarity. We need to do something about our constitution. If not a written constitution, then at least definiteness in our constitution about things like referendums. We need to reform the voting system. In my opinion, as I said earlier, we need to lower the voting age and make it mandatory in schools that recent history and civics should be an important component of preparation for possessing the vote, which in my view is a civic duty that people have, like paying taxes and so on. So we should really prepare ourselves for it. Get people to be much more alert, much more informed, and much more aware of the very great importance of these votes. We should get rid of the first past the post system. In order to see the stupidity of that system, you only have to think. Imagine a constituency of 100 people, 100 voters, and 10 people stand for election, 8 of whom get 10 votes each, 1 of whom gets 9 votes, and 1 of whom gets 11 votes. Person with 11 votes goes to Parliament, representing 11 people out of 100. And the other 89, their vote has been for nothing, is counted for nothing. It's not at all represented. That's unspeakable. It's not the way that a democracy should be run, and it's certainly not the way that you can get the consent of the people reflected in the composition of those who populate the institutions. And it means that the institutions can be played with, they can be gamed by the people who get into them, and that too is something that we need to stop. We need to stop the party machine system from turning MPs into representatives of party political lines rather than of the people who vote for them. So those suggestions are very, very modest ones. They don't argue for sortition or direct democracy or government by jury or whatever. They're very modest, and our constitution could very well achieve them with very little pain. But they are necessary, and I think that what happened in the EU referendum and the Trump election shows that these two great democracies, ours in the UK and the American democracy, have been exposed as ineffectively expressing either the will of the people or ineffectively harvesting the consent of the people, and they are not functioning properly. That's my case. I rest it. Thank you very much. My apologies. I'm so sorry, I've gone on far too long. I didn't mean to.
No, so thank you very much for that. I think we only have time for a question or two, so I'll hand straight over to the floor. If you do have a question, just raise your hand and wait for a steward to come to you. So if we get to the back left.
You mentioned that inequality is particularly toxic for societies. But what sort of evidence do we have that this is the case, that Mark Zuckerberg, having a lot of money is the thing that is making people angry specifically, as opposed to their own situations? It seems like a more plausible culprit would be the breakdown of civic institutions and sort of social organizations and community ties within sort of lower income areas, rather than the fact that technology allows a few people to become richer, especially because most of them are providing services like Bill Gates did or like Mark Zuckerberg did.
Okay, this is a good question and complex answer required, but just to sort of cut to the chase on it, when things break down in a society, as for example they do in wartime, it doesn't entail that there will be a breakdown in everything else. On the contrary, very often societies tend to come together when they're with the real fracture in the structure of society. Think about Britain during the Second World War. There was a lot of sense of common cause. We're all in it together. When institutions and normal ways of life break down. So I'm not so sure that it's breakdown of civic structures that is the problem. Nor is it the problem that there should be wealthy and successful people. If you take the United States as an example, In the United States, the great American dream is that everybody can become a millionaire and everybody can become a president. But if you're in the queue and you're expecting the queue to move forward so you can get to the sunny uplands, but the queue stops moving and you're stuck and the queue is stationary. And worse still, people start queue jumping. You start getting other people jumping into the queue ahead of you. Women, gays, Mexicans, you get really cross. And this is what's happened with a lot of white supremacist attitudes in the United States. They're hostile to immigrants, they're hostile to women, they're hostile to gays, because they think that their queues are moving ahead and yours isn't. This is a kind of anecdotal example of how resentment about differentials in society is made worse by increase in those differentials.
And just one more question, if we get to the middle, the front.
You mentioned how recent democracy is in its respected pedestal. As you look ahead to the evolution of government structures, do you see a new form of governance as being on the horizon, or for the immediate and foreseeable future, do you think it'll just be more refined democracy, or is there a next step in the evolution that you anticipate?
Well, you may remember that when heavier-than-air flight began at the beginning of the 20th century, people noticed that biplanes flew better than monoplanes, and so they predicted that the airplanes of the future would have 12 wings, and they were wrong. And that's a great illustration of the fact that prediction is a bit of a mug's game. So I'm not going to predict. What I can tell you, however, is what my preference would be. So my preference would be for a very scrupulous and transparent functioning of institutions which really do rest on the consent of the people and whose operation can be so well understood and so well monitored that we don't get individuals manipulating them and redirecting them. The danger that we face at the moment is that because we have these new technologies, and because it would be possible to have daily referenda by the press of a button on your iPhone or your television set, that there would be a temptation to go in that direction. People look at examples like Switzerland, where there are frequent referendums, for example, and they say, isn't that much more? Doesn't that take government close to the people and so on? Well, if you look at the Swiss experience, you see turnouts are very low, and the results of those referendums are very conservative. And this is because after a while, people stop voting or stop being engaged because it happens so often, and they're bored and they won't have to read through the papers. And the people who do tend to read through the papers are the better off and the better educated, who tend, as they get older, to be more conservative with a small or a big C. And so there you have an example of direct democracy turning into a rather static, rather middle-aged, middle-class, middle-brow sort of society. So the system that we have at the moment, which incorporates a degree of the adversarial, the argument over great questions of policy and social direction and the like, has many merits, providing that the machinery that turns that into government is clean. The machinery must be good. At the moment it isn't. And a danger has been introduced to it, which is that because all of us now inhabit this cyber universe, and we are being tracked and monitored, and our footsteps very closely followed, and we are being messaged all the time in 1,000 different ways, that we really need to make that much more transparent, and we ourselves need to be much more alert to the possibility of manipulation.
Fantastic. I know everyone here is going to be disappointed to say we are actually out of time. But Professor, thank you very much for coming. I know that was very interesting. I know. Thanks so much for that.
I'm sorry I went on.
No, it was really fantastic.